The atmosphere in the courtroom was paralyzing, thick with a tension so sharp it felt like it might snap at any moment. Outside, the sidewalk was a sea of satellite trucks and flashing lights. Inside, every bench was packed with journalists, their lenses trained like weapons on the man at the defense table, the city's most feared shadow. This was no ordinary sentencing. This was the reckoning of John Hoffman, the king of shadow, the man allegedly responsible for a high-profile estate massacre 5 years ago that left behind only 2 silent witnesses. Identical twin girls, Shirley and Stoker, had lived in a world of absolute silence since that horrific night. Today, they were no longer toddlers. They were survivors ready to face the man the world called a monster. Before we reveal the words that stopped the heart of the legal system, let me know in the comments. Do you believe a person's past defines their future? If you're ready for a story that proves the most powerful truths often come in the smallest packages, hit that like button and subscribe, because the testimony you're about to hear is going to shatter every assumption you have about good and evil. The air in the transport tunnels beneath the court was cold, smelling of damp concrete and old iron. For 5 years, John Hoffman had lived in this gray world, a scarred giant who had accepted the mantle of a butcher to keep a much darker secret buried. He sat with his head bowed, his massive, tattooed hands clasped together, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd above him. He knew what they called him. He knew the evidence the district attorney had spent years manufacturing. He had remained silent through it all, enduring the monster label, because it was the only way to ensure the 2 girls in the white dresses stayed invisible to the people who really pulled the trigger. John Hoffman, the man the tabloids branded the King of Shadow, sat at the defense table with his massive shoulders hunched, his head bowed as if the weight of the city's judgment was physically crushing him. His face, a rugged landscape of jagged scars, was a map of a life spent in the darkest corners of the underworld. Beneath the collar of his orange prison jumpsuit, the edges of intricate tattoos crept up his neck, symbols of a syndicate that had long ago traded its soul for power. For 5 years, he had endured the monster label without a single word of protest, accepting the public's hatred like a penance to ensure the survivors stayed invisible to the people who really pulled the trigger. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of anticipation when the heavy oak doors creaked open, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Into the light stepped Shirley and Stoker, their identical white Sunday dresses glowing with a blinding purity. Hoffman's scarred hands tightened into white-knuckled fists. He remained a silent giant, reinforcing a lie to protect the only 2 secrets the syndicate couldn't find. The district attorney stood before the jury with the practiced air of a predator, laying out a methodical narrative that made the courtroom feel like a closing cage. On the large projector screen, grainy surveillance stills flickered to life, showing a dark, hulking silhouette moving through the rain-slicked grounds of the rival estate. "This isn't just a shadow," the prosecutor declared, his finger pointing directly at the scarred man in orange. "This is John Hoffman, caught in the act of orchestrating a cold-blooded execution." The evidence was presented as airtight. Forensic reports allegedly placed Hoffman's fingerprints on discarded shell casings, and testimony from former associates painted him as a man who took pleasure in systematic elimination. As the bloody details of the raid were recounted, the atmosphere in the room grew toxic with resentment. Hoffman remained the scared giant, maintaining his stony silence even as he was labeled a heartless butcher. To the jury, the trap had already snapped shut, leaving Hoffman as a man simply waiting for the formal verdict to catch up to the monster described by the state. The prosecution's narrative was abruptly severed as the side doors groaned open, admitting 2 figures who seemed to belong to a different world. Shirley and Stoker stepped into the aisle, their identical white dresses shimmering with a purity that felt like a direct indictment of the courtroom's darkness. As they moved, the frantic scratching of pens ceased, leaving only a deafening, tomb-like silence. Judge Brennan began to direct the children toward the stand, but the twins did not turn. They moved with an eerie calm, their small shoes clicking against the marble as they bypassed the prosecution entirely. The district attorney froze, his dramatic gesture hanging uselessly in the air. Every eye watched as the white lilies ignored the bench to approach the defendant's table. Hoffman's stone mask finally fractured, His breath hitched as the girls stopped inches from him. Their universe had narrowed to the scarred man in orange, their small hands reaching out to find the warmth of his tattooed grip. Would you like me to proceed to Chapter 4, where the twins finally break their 5-year silence? The courtroom felt as though it had been plunged underwater, a heavy, airless pressure weighing down every spectator as Shirley and Stoker stood before the man the world called a butcher. Judge Brennan leaned forward, her gavel resting forgotten, her voice a soft whisper as she asked the girls if they understood where they were. The twins didn't look at her. They remained anchored to John Hoffman, their small hands gripping his tattooed fingers with a ferocity that defied their fragile appearance. "He didn't do it," Shirley said, her voice small but piercingly clear, ringing through the silent chamber like a bell in a tomb. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as the girls broke their 5-year silence. Stoker looked up, her eyes brimming with a tearful, ancient certainty. "He didn't start the fire," she added, her voice trembling but unbroken. "He carried us through it." The words hung in the air, a direct strike to the heart of the prosecution's case, as Hoffman let out a jagged, choked breath he had been holding for half a decade. The tension in the room coiled tighter as Shirley reached into the delicate lace of her collar, her small fingers pulling at a thin silver chain hidden beneath her white dress. The gallery watched in a trance-like state as she produced a tarnished, heart-shaped locket, its surface scarred by the same heat that had marked John Hoffman's face. Stoker took his hand, her gaze never wavering from the jury as she whispered that this was the gift he had pressed into their palms before the roof collapsed. With a trembling click, Shirley snapped the locket open, revealing a microphoto tucked behind the glass, a candid, terrifying image of the red-eyed man and his associates standing among the embers. It was the one piece of evidence the King of Shadow had risked everything to preserve, a silent witness more powerful than any fabricated forensic report. As the locket caught the courtroom lights, the air grew cold. The hunters in the back row realized their masks were finally slipping, and the man in orange was no longer their scapegoat. Would you like me to move on to Chapter 6, where the camera pans to the panicked traitor in the gallery? The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from stunned silence to a predatory chill as the girls turned their gaze away from the defendant and toward the back of the room. Following the line of Shirley's outstretched finger, the camera lens panned slowly across the rows of spectators, settling on a man in a sharp, charcoal suit whose anonymity was rapidly dissolving. His face, previously a mask of bored indifference, twisted into a frantic grimace as the twins' eyes locked onto his. "The man with the gold watch," Stoker whispered, her voice carrying an authority that made the gallery recoil. A bead of sweat broke on the man's forehead, glistening under the fluorescent lights as he realized the King of Shadow was no longer the one being hunted. His hand, trembling with a sudden, violent urgency, began to slide toward the inner pocket of his jacket, seeking the weapon he had hoped never to use in a house of law. The silence of the courtroom was replaced by the low, dangerous rumble of a panicked crowd realizing a predator was in their midst, and the shadow of the real syndicate finally stretched across the marble floor. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 7, where the courtroom erupts into chaos as the vultures attempt to silence the witnesses? The heavy silence shattered like glass as the man in the charcoal suit lunged from his seat, his hand emerging from his jacket with the cold glint of steel. Screams erupted from the gallery, a violent wave of panic turning the courtroom into a frantic arena of fleeing bodies and overturned chairs. The syndicate's vultures, hidden throughout the room, rose in a coordinated strike to silence the twins before another word could be spoken. In a single, explosive motion, John Hoffman didn't flee for his own life. He tore against the restraints of his chair, the metal screeching as he lunged over the defense table. His massive, tattooed frame became a living wall of iron and ink, shielding Shirley and Stoker from the line of fire. He pulled the trembling girls beneath the heavy oak of the table, wrapping his scarred arms around them as a barrage of movement descended upon the room. As the King of Shadow braced for the impact of the vulture's desperation, he was no longer a defendant in a jumpsuit, but a guardian standing between the light of the twins and the darkness of his own past. The smoke of the struggle had barely cleared when John Hoffman finally lifted his head, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that silenced the lingering echoes of the chaos. Sarah Miller, the stunned prosecutor, stood among the wreckage of her case, her belief in the system shattered as she looked from the monster to the real killers in handcuffs. Recognizing the truth in the twins' eyes, she knelt by the defense table, not as an adversary, but as an ally. Hoffman didn't whisper. He spoke with the iron authority of a man who had nothing left to lose, finally nomming the high-ranking officials and syndicate captains he had shielded for 5 long years. One by one, the vultures were exposed as he detailed the betrayal that had led to the fire, turning the trial into a funeral for the syndicate's power. The King of Shadow was crumbling, but in the ruins of his reputation, he was building a fortress around Shirley and Stoker. The names he uttered were the final nails in a coffin for the men who had stolen the twins' voices, as the truth finally burned brighter than the flames of the past. Would you like me to conclude the story with Chapter 9, where Hoffman walks into the light with Shirley and Stoker? The gavel fell one final time, not as a death knell, but as a liberation. John Hoffman stood as the shackles were finally struck from his wrists, the heavy weight of the monster label dissolving into the hushed, repentant atmosphere of the room. He was no longer the King of Shadow. The exoneration was a formal surrender of his past. As the massive oak doors swung open, he stepped out onto the courthouse steps, squinting against the midday sun that felt foreign after 5 years of gray concrete. The news vans and cameras were still there, but the lens of the world had shifted. Hoffman didn't look at the reporters. His focus remained on the 2 small hands tucked securely into his own. Shirley and Stoker walked beside him, their white dresses catching the wind, their faces no longer etched with the terror of the fire, but with the quiet peace of the found. He was a man without an empire, stripped of his tattoo's dark meaning, yet as he descended the stairs toward a future he never thought he'd see, he realized this was the only freedom that ever mattered. The shadow was gone. There was only the light and the 2 girls who had led him into it. Would you like me to help you brainstorm a new story title, or perhaps a sequel concept where the twins and Hoffman face a new challenge?